joy and sorrow, challenges and change, with growing up and growing old. Does it all end here? Is this the inevitable conclusion to life's journey? Or is there something beyond this life, a spiritual realm of some kind where the soul resides when we lay this body down? In short, is there a heaven? The questions are as old as humanity and as new as the latest scientific research. Where did we come from? Why are we here? And where are we going? Is there a life beyond the one we are experiencing here and now? A place where pain and suffering no longer exist? A place called heaven? Perhaps if we can find the answer to those questions, it will unravel many of the mysteries that have haunted humankind since the beginning of time. You might be surprised to learn that for some among us, the mystery has been solved. There are those who claim to have actually seen heaven. Even more surprising, perhaps, is the level to which modern science has raised the search for heaven. Could it be they are responding to the overwhelming need for answers? Current studies reveal that the vast majority of people the world over profess a belief in some form of life after this one, and in something or some place almost universally referred to as heaven.
In an automobile accident in 1975, my spirit left my body in the emergency room. I experienced the warmth and the presence of God and the peace while I saw my body racked in pain on the emergency room table. Yes, I believe in the afterlife. I know it exists. I've experienced it.
And even though the world's religions have their own definition of what heaven is, in the public mind the questions remain. Is there any evidence that heaven does in fact exist? Are there scientific signposts to guide us on the path of discovery? And if we find the borders of heaven, do we also discover the gates of hell? For at least 6,000 years, heaven has been a place of mystery and devotion for people the world over. Mighty cathedrals with lofty spires and humble village chapels are all built with the hope of heaven as part of the architect's plan. So, where do we begin a search that is already late getting started? Or are we at the very beginning of a whole new era of knowledge and understanding? Recent advances in medical technique have allowed doctors to bring more and more people back from the edge of death. These medical miracles have given rise to a new phenomenon known as the near-death experience. People who apparently slip from the doctor's grasp, but come back to life, so to speak, and bring with them remarkably vivid and unexplainable visions. Let's begin with some of the most recent and compelling events. In spite of heroic efforts, eventually even the best physicians are forced to just give up. But in this particular instance, the patient apparently didn't. According to all medical and physical science, what happened in this particular emergency room was, well, impossible.
What?
I saw the most amazing thing.
The woman told the doctor she had left her body entirely while those in the room had been working to revive her. She felt herself being pulled up through several floors of the hospital until she found herself on the roof. She was enjoying the view of the skyline when she noticed something red out of the corner of her eye. It was, she said, a shoe. Everyone was extremely skeptical. After all, hadn't she been completely comatose? But when Dr. Raymond Moody, author of Life After Life, heard about it, he was more inclined to accept the woman's story. Dr. Moody has researched hundreds of these events.
The near-death experience is a powerful statement of the reality of the afterlife. As resuscitation techniques improve, more and more people are having profoundly meaningful experiences when they return from the verge of death. They tell us that they find themselves out of their bodies and yet still functioning and alive. As a medical doctor, I began my clinical investigations of these experiences somewhat dubious, and then quickly realized that we can only ignore the evidence for so long.
Inevitably, one of those present insisted on proving the woman's story. It seemed simple enough. Have someone go up to the roof and check.
Eventually, the reality of what's happening begins to set in, and you become aware that the only way of accounting for the decisive commonalities in these experiences is to assume their validity.
That's the shoe. That's the red shoe.
Under any circumstances, it seems highly unlikely that a woman brought in on the ground floor in a coma could have any knowledge of a red shoe on the roof. What we needed was some scientific way to demonstrate that the body and the spirit can exist separately. If that could be discovered, it would strongly suggest that there could indeed be something beyond this life. But how could that be done? Sometimes, what isn't planned turns out to be the best course of action. In the case of Pam Reynolds, a stunning array of scientific instruments and measurements were in place at the very moment of death. The results were astonishing. At age 35, Pam was diagnosed with a life-threatening brain aneurysm. Her only hope was a very unusual operation. In order to fix the problem and save her life, doctors would have to drain the blood out of Pam Reynolds' head. What's more, her body temperature would be lowered to 60 degrees, her heartbeat and breathing would stop completely, and her brain waves would be flattened. Doctors who perform this intense procedure have nicknamed it standstill, because for all intents and purposes, Pam Reynolds would be dead. Because what happened was so thoroughly unique and unexpected, Dr. Michael Sabom, a cardiologist and author of Light and Death, made an extensive evaluation of the Pam Reynolds experience.
The process of death, scientifically, now is known to be a process and not a point in time. It starts with normal waking reality and ends up in irreversible death. During this process, the body dies at different rates. The problem we have as scientists and physicians is to determine when the brain is actually dead, i.e. when the person is actually dead.
In the case of Pam Reynolds, one of the surgeon's main concerns was seizure activity, which could prove deadly during such a delicate procedure. To guard against this and other complications, Pam's brain and body were extensively instrumented and monitored, which makes what happened next even more intriguing. Pam told the doctors she left her body and became a spectator to what they were doing to her body. Later, she was able to describe people, procedures, and even medical instruments she could not possibly have seen.
Pam Reynolds had a very deep near-death experience at the time that she had documented no brainwave activity, no brainstem activity, and actually the blood had been physically drained from her head at the time. So this eliminates the possibility that this was a seizure phenomenon, because during her experience she had no seizure activity on the EEG. In addition, she had plugs in both of her ears, and so she could not have physically heard what was being discussed in the operating room during the surgical procedure, and she could recall the accurate discussions that were going on between the surgeons at the time that she was having her experience.
Remember, every body reflex was being monitored. She was in a profoundly inactive state. But Pam Reynolds somehow was able to describe a particular surgical tool in amazing detail. A tool which she would later say looked like an electric toothbrush with a dent in it. She even noticed that the tool had interchangeable blades and that these were kept in something that she said looked like a socket wrench case. How could Pam Reynolds have described with such amazing accuracy the details of what took place in the operating room when she was, according to all the monitoring devices, dead? The Pam Reynolds experience would seem to add one more bit of evidence that the spirit lives on when the body dies. But lives on where? Are we any closer to identifying the place those spirits might reside? Are we getting closer to heaven? What is it that keeps hundreds of millions of people the world over fascinated by something they've never seen? Or are there those who have seen heaven and actually left a record of their experience? Is this notion of a near-death experience, or NDE as it is widely referred to, a purely modern phenomenon? Or does it have some historical, even scriptural roots? The concept of a God in heaven who is active in the affairs of humankind has been powerfully portrayed in painting, literature, and song for centuries. Interestingly, although different religions vary slightly in their concept of heaven, all of them focus on the ideas of peace, serenity, and some sort of justice or retribution. These concepts seem to bridge all societal norms. Again, according to a recent Gallup poll, over 70% of those polled believe in the existence of a heaven of some kind. Strong evidence indeed for the power of ideas. Or could it be the idea of a powerful God? Christianity, for example, has for centuries proclaimed that Jesus Christ died on the cross, was buried, and yet emerged from the tomb alive. This, according to the Christian view, is a matter of historical fact. To a Christian, the reality of heaven needs no further proof than the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In like manner, Muslims accept the ascension of Muhammad from the sacred spot known as the Dome of the Rock as proof that heaven exists. While in the land of Tibet, followers of the Dalai Lama believe there is only one spirit of the Lama, a perpetual incarnation that routinely moves from one Dalai Lama to the next as the physical body wears out or is destroyed. This is sufficient proof for his followers to accept heaven as a foregone conclusion. Traditional Judaism, on the other hand, firmly believes that death is not the end of human existence. But because Judaism is primarily focused on the here and now rather than the afterlife, it gives a great deal of room for personal opinion. It is possible for an Orthodox Jew to believe that the souls of the righteous go to a place similar to the Christian heaven, or that they simply wait until the coming of the Messiah when they will be resurrected. And of course, there are those whose belief system excludes any possibility of life beyond the grave. The skeptic finds no comfort in either the nature of the evidence nor the amount of it. For example, another Gallup poll reports that 8 million Americans, approximately 5% of the adult population, have had a near-death experience. And that's just in today's world. Apparently, this out-of-body event has been going on for a long, long time. Plato wrote of it in his Dialogues.
We believe, do we not, that death is the separation of the soul from the body, and that the state of being dead is the state in which the body is separated from the soul, and the soul exists alone by itself.
Plato frames the question as a foregone conclusion. And the Bible, written and compiled over hundreds of years, contains many stories that suggest some people have had access to the world beyond. For example, in Acts chapter 7, verses 55 and 56, Stephen has a pre-death vision. Surrounded by his enemies, Stephen cries out,
"Look, I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God."
And in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul describes what many think was his own near-death experience.
And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, was caught up to paradise. He heard inexpressible things, things that man is not permitted to tell.
In this instance, Paul tells us he was actually there, in paradise. Because of their biblical setting, these examples are accepted by believers as proof. But to skeptics, they are merely another example of anecdotal evidence. Researchers, however, are far from being discouraged. While the search for heaven undoubtedly brings us face to face with unknown, often unexplainable occurrences, doctors and scientists are not ignoring the possibilities raised by these anecdotal experiences. The fact is, new clues in the search for heaven have been and are being uncovered, even in the halls of science. In order for something to be judged scientific, certain rules must be applied. For example, if a theory is to be judged on a scientific basis, knowledge of facts or principles must be capable of being gained through systematic study. The question is, does the anecdotal evidence of what happens beyond death's door lend itself to scientific scrutiny? Dr. Moody's large body of work suggests that indeed it does.
I began my research by talking with about 150 people who had been to the brink of death and had experiences. I was able to identify 15 common elements that occur in these experiences, regardless of the sex, age, or medical condition of the patient. First of all, when a person reaches the point of greatest physical distress, they often hear themselves pronounced dead by the attending physician. They hear an uncomfortable noise and feel themselves moving very rapidly through some sort of aperture, like a tunnel. They find themselves outside of their bodies, watching the resuscitation attempts like a spectator. Soon other things begin to happen. Others come to meet them. They say that they glimpse the spirits of relatives and friends who have already passed away. And they find themselves welcomed by a love that's beyond anything they have ever known. At some point, a being of light and love appears and asks them questions and enables them to review a panorama consisting of every event of their lives. And then at a critical point, they are told that they must go back to Earth.
Interestingly, in all cases, the person wants to stay, but for various reasons is required or chooses to come back. And all of them, upon their return, report a complete loss of any further fear of death. Could it be that all of these people are actually describing heaven? And if we prove the existence of heaven, will that also prove the existence of its dark alternative, a place called hell? Is there anything to be gained from an examination of the life of the person caught up in this experience? Are there long-lasting and significant changes that take place in a person's life after such a traumatic event? Or does it just disappear into the forgotten shadows of memory? It's not something people like to think about, much less talk about, but the discovery of heaven, based on the readings of almost any religious scripture, almost guarantees the existence of its opposite domain, the fearful underworld, Hades, the kingdom of the devil, commonly known as hell. In Luke chapter 16, Jesus tells the story of a rich man who died and is sent to hell. He looks up from hell where he is in torment and sees Abraham far away. He begs Abraham to have pity on him because, he pleads, I am in agony in this fire. Are there near-death experiences that echo this scenario? As a matter of fact, there are. Prior to his own near-death experience, Howard Storm had always considered himself to be a free thinker. He was also an avowed atheist. To him, belief in God was absurd. But all of that changed during a trip to Paris in 1985.
Honey, Howard?
Storm was diagnosed with a perforation in his small intestine. The agony of his condition weakened Howard. Knowing death was near, he said goodbye to his wife and slipped off into oblivion.
When I opened my eyes, I found myself standing next to the bed, and I thought, this is impossible, because just moments before I'd been dying. Then I saw Beverly, my wife, sitting in the chair opposite me on the other side of the bed, and I tried to talk to her, but she acted like she couldn't see me or hear me. No one could see me or hear me. And then I heard voices calling me from outside the room. These people outside the room were saying, "Hurry up, come with us. We've been waiting for you a long time. You've got to go now." And I thought they'd come to help me. I kept asking them who they were, but they just insisted that they had come for me, they had been waiting for me, and it was time to go with them. So I thought they were to take me to my operation, and I went with them. They started to push and pull at me, yelling and screaming at me, and I fought back as hard as I could. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, thousands. There's no way to tell in that darkness, swarming all over me. The more I fought, the more vicious they became. To my horror, I realized that they were tearing me apart, consuming me. All of them were laughing and taunting me, and the more they hurt me, the better they liked it. As I lay there on the ground in a fetal position, trying to protect myself from their kicks and their taunting, I heard a voice say, "Pray to God." And I thought, I don't believe in God. How can I pray? And a second time it said, "Pray to God," and a third time. And it came out all mixed up with the 23rd Psalm and the Pledge of Allegiance and the Lord's Prayer, just little bits of them that I could remember. But the people around me hated any mention of God, and they were screaming at me. And in my desperation, I yelled out into the darkness, "Jesus, please save me." And with that, a tiny light appeared in the darkness and became very bright. And it was the most brilliant, beautiful light that lifted me up and filled me with ecstasy. And I knew absolutely that this was the Jesus that I'd believed in as a child. He took me out of that horrible place that I now know was hell, and we began to approach heaven. With Jesus and the angels that he called over to us, we went over my life from its beginning to the end, and I was so ashamed of the things that I had done in my life. But the important thing is I knew that God loved me, and Jesus and the angels loved me, in spite of the things that I had done. And eventually they told me that I had to come back into this world, which was almost unbearable to me to be separated from them. But I knew that through their love for me and my love for them, that I would never be separated from God or the heavenly beings or Jesus again.
Incredible as his experience was, Howard Storm is still today convinced it was real. He credits that single event for causing a complete turnaround in his life. But what of those whose experience is not as chilling as Howard Storm's? It's understandable how a brush with hell might change a person's life, but what happens to those who experience something entirely different? In one of the more famous near-death experiences, Dannion Brinkley also endured a life-altering encounter. Danny's experience is recounted in complete detail in his book, Saved by the Light, but the basic facts are these. Danny was talking to a friend on the phone in the bedroom of his home in Aiken, South Carolina.
Look, I gotta go. No, I just don't like thunderstorms.
Danny had never been comfortable during thunderstorms, and he was anxious to get off the phone and get away from anything electric. Suddenly, there was an explosion in his ear, and Danny was jerked out of his shoes and hurled back onto the bed, his body shattered almost beyond recognition. Danny remembers leaving his body and watching as his wife Sandy tried to keep him alive with CPR. Once he dropped back into his tortured body, but not for long. Soon he was out again, watching the medical technicians desperately trying to save his life. As the ambulance began to pull away, Danny saw a number of amazing things. But let's have Danny describe the experience in his own words.
There was a sound of chimes as the tunnel spiraled toward me and then around me. Then all of a sudden there was no Sandy crying. There were no paramedics working on me. There was no ambulance radio chatter. There was just me and the tunnel. I looked ahead into the darkness. There was a light up there. I began to move toward it quickly as possible. I was moving without legs at a high rate of speed. Ahead the light became brighter and brighter until it overtook the darkness and it left me standing in a paradise of brilliant light. It was the brightest light I'd ever seen, but it was soothing to my eyes. I looked to my right and could see a silver form appearing like a silhouette through a mist. As it approached, I began to feel a deep sense of love that encompassed all the meanings of that word. It was as though I was seeing a lover, a mother, a best friend, and multiples 1,000-fold. This being engulfed me, and as it did, I began to experience my whole life, feeling and seeing everything that had ever happened to me.
Suddenly, Danny was back at the hospital, looking down at the frantic scene in the emergency room. The ambulance attendants had done their best to try and revive him, but they had given up. Now he watched as the doctors, too, finally gave up, pulled the sheet up over his head, and pushed the gurney out into the hallway to wait for the attendants from the morgue. Then perhaps the most frightening part of the whole experience. Suddenly, he was back in his body, under the sheet, looking up at it with tortured eyes. Danny couldn't move or even make a noise, and the orderlies were coming to take him to the morgue. What's more, now that he was back in his body, it seemed like even his thoughts caused him pain. He hoped whoever it was whose shadow he could see through the sheet was paying attention, because he did the only thing he could do. He blew on the sheet from underneath.
Hey, come here, he's alive. Whoa. Hey!
The body Danny came back to was horribly damaged. It would be months before he could move his arms or stand, let alone walk. But the experience would bring about a profound change in his life.
One of the most provocative points about the near-death experience is it begins to open up an understanding that there is a life after death. Not only is there a life after death, there is a system by which we leave this world to enter that one. And the more we study that, the greater the opportunity to lift the veil so that we know that there is not only this life, but a life after this one. From my personal experience, I know there's a life after death. Why? I've had 3 of these experiences, 1 death experience and 2 near-death experiences. Struck by lightning in 1975, declared clinically dead for 28 minutes. Collapsing of heart failure and having emergency open heart surgery in 1989. And then having to have emergency brain surgery in 1997. All complications from being struck by lightning. There is a life after death, a wondrous, glorious place that awaits us. The near-death experience begins to truly open the door where science and medicine can begin to look at life after death and if there is a heaven. But personally, after going through 3 of these experiences, I'd like to say this. If you don't believe there's a life after death, you're missing the greatest part of your own life.
From that day to this, Dannion Brinkley has devoted his life to helping others. For both Howard Storm and Dannion Brinkley, a profound experience, perhaps with both heaven and hell, brought about life-altering changes that appear to be permanent. They appear to know something the rest of us don't, but will the rest of us have to die to find out? Or is there some other way? If the medical community is beginning to quantify these small miracles, are there other scientific studies beginning to show promising results? Implicit in the search for heaven is the possibility of an answer to the whole question of creation, not just the end of life, but the beginning as well. Is it possible to determine how valid the anecdotal evidence is? What does the world of physics, mathematics, and astronomy have to say about it? Could it all be merely psychological? Or are there serious scientific studies that are being undertaken? The evidence uncovered so far suggests not only an increasing level of awareness of some kind of spiritual being in all of us, but a growing sense of the importance of that part of the human existence. Due largely to the ability of modern medicine to rescue people from death, a growing number of people are emerging as witnesses to the concept of some kind of life beyond the grave. As our search continues, a number of highly qualified researchers are trying to discover ways to demonstrate that these experiences are fact, not fantasy. Some areas of psychological study, for example, still suggest it is the cultural identity we all carry with us that actually determines what we think about death and heaven. According to this line of reasoning, what we have been taught to expect is what we, in fact, get. Could it be as simple as that? Dr. Kenneth Ring, a professor emeritus of psychology at the University of Connecticut and the author of Lessons from the Light and Heading Toward Omega, decided to tackle that notion head-on. On the assumption that if cultural conditioning actually sets the stage, so to speak, for the clear and vivid images of a near-death experience, a blind person, particularly someone who has been blind from birth, would have a very different experience.
I recently did a study in which I interviewed 31 persons who were blind about their near-death experiences, including a number who were blind from birth. 80% of these blind persons report being able to see things of this world during their near-death encounters. When people talk about near-death experiences and describe them in heavenly terms, they often talk about a realm of tremendous dazzling light, of supernal beauty, and a feeling of total unconditional acceptance and love. I think one effect of having interviewed so many people about their near-death experiences on me personally is that it's made me feel a lot more comfortable about death. I think death is, I wouldn't say it's something to look forward to, but I don't think we have to have anything to fear in the moment of death itself, however painful the process of dying may be.
Again, I think the near-death